Every DRAM chip that leaves CXMT's fab in Hefei cheap enough to undercut Samsung, Micron, and SK Hynix roots back. Through a machine that sits in Veldhoven, the Netherlands, that China has not been permitted to import since 2019, the machine never arrived. The chip exists anyway, and the unbroken line between that chip in your device and the tool it never touched is the thing worth following. The question is not whether CXMT found a workaround. It did. The question is what that workaround costs the network, in yield, in density, in time, and whether the detour eventually closes into a road or whether it stays a detour forever. A breakthrough is not a chip running faster. A breakthrough is a new route appearing where the map showed only a dead end. What I am drawing here is which junctions on CXMT's supply web have been rerouted, which are still exposed, and where the line terminates at a node no domestic alternative has reached. Follow a single wafer backward through the supply web and the nodes accumulate. The silicon substrate it is cut from, the deposition tools that build its cell layers, the lithography pass that defines its cell dimensions, and finally, the scanner that makes or breaks the density math. That is the map. Let's trace it. The wafer begins before the fab. It begins as a silicon ingot grown in a furnace, sliced, polished to a 300 mm disc with a surface flat to within a few atoms, and shipped to Hefei. Trace that ingot to its supplier, and you arrive at a node dominated by a small number of Japanese and German producers: Shin-Etsu Chemical, Sumco, Siltronic, and SK Siltron. These companies supply the bulk of the world's ultra-high purity wafers at the 300 mm format CXMT requires. Think of the silicon wafer as the road surface every other piece of infrastructure is built on. You can design the bridge and the traffic signals before the road is poured, but nothing moves until the substrate exists and meets grade. A wafer with elevated defect density is a road with hidden sinkholes. The geometry you pattern on top of it inherits every flaw underneath. China has not ignored this node. Domestic producers, including Zing Semiconductor and National Silicon Industry Group, have expanded capacity materially over recent years. Industry analysts report the growth as real and ongoing. What is not fully public is independent benchmark data on purity and defect density at leading-edge 300 mm specifications from those domestic suppliers. CXMT has not disclosed its sourcing mix. The line at this node is not terminated. Domestic capacity exists, runs, and supplies product. The unresolved question is whether it meets the tightest tolerances at volume, and that question does not have a clean public answer yet. Node. 300 mm silicon wafer, a junction China has already routed around. Domestic capacity is real and growing. Leading-edge purity benchmarks are not publicly confirmed, but production is running, and the line is not terminated here. That wafer is now in the fab. It needs layers built on it before any pattern is printed. A DRAM cell is not a flat object. It is a vertical structure, capacitors stacked, word lines etched into the substrate at tolerances measured in nanometers. The tools that deposit and remove those layers, atomic layer deposition systems, chemical vapor deposition chambers, plasma etch tools, are a category dominated by Applied Materials, Lam Research, and Tokyo Electron. These three companies define the tooling standard for how many layers a fab can reliably build and how uniformly it can build them. Export controls tightened by the United States Commerce Department in 2022 and extended in subsequent rounds placed restrictions on the most advanced configurations of these tools for Chinese fabs operating below defined technology nodes. Applied Materials and Lam Research have both disclosed in earnings calls and public filings that portions of their China revenue were affected. Tokyo Electron, a Japanese company, operates under a parallel set of restrictions aligned with coordination between the United States and Japan after 2023. These are company disclosures, not analyst projections. The masonry analogy holds here. Deposition and etch tools do not define the blueprint, but they lay every brick. A fab that cannot refresh or upgrade these tools hits a ceiling as process generations advance. The important detail is that CXMT's fab was built with a substantial installed base before the tightest controls took effect. That installed base runs. What the fab cannot do is easily procure the most advanced new configurations of the same tools as restrictions tighten. Domestic Chinese alternatives, including systems from NAURA and AMEC, are in development and in some cases shipping. Independent confirmation of parity with the most advanced applied materials or Lam Research configurations at leading-edge process nodes is not yet public. Node: Deposition and etch tooling. A choke point with a bypass under construction. No confirmed volume at leading-edge specifications. CXMT's existing installed base runs. Domestic alternatives are credible and progressing, but the gap to the most advanced configurations is not publicly closed. The wafer now reaches the step that defines everything about cell density. It reaches the lithography pass. This is where the detour the whole story turns on begins. To print the fine features of a DRAM cell, a fab needs a lithography scanner, a machine that projects a circuit pattern onto the wafer using light. The shorter the wavelength of light, the finer the features you can resolve. The most advanced node uses extreme ultraviolet light at 13.5 nanometers, produced by a machine only ASML manufactures. ASML stopped shipping extreme ultraviolet systems to China following Dutch export controls introduced in 2023, coordinated with restrictions from the United States and Japan. CXMT does not have extreme ultraviolet lithography. What it has instead is deep ultraviolet lithography at an older wavelength, combined with a technique called multi-patterning. Multi-patterning is the technique of running the same wafer through a lithography scanner multiple times. Each pass lays down a partial pattern. Together, the passes resolve to a finer feature than any single pass could print. It works. Leading-edge fabs used multi-patterning before extreme ultraviolet existed, and some still use it for specific layers. The cost is not technical impossibility. The cost is structural. Each additional pass multiplies tool time, alignment error accumulation, and yield risk. A feature that extreme ultraviolet prints in one pass may require 2, 3, or 4 deep ultraviolet passes to approach a comparable pitch. The wafer spends longer in the scanner. More steps mean more chances for misalignment. Yield: the fraction of chips on a wafer that function correctly, compresses under that pressure. Multi-patterning is the equivalent of routing every truck across a city through a series of one-way streets because the direct bridge is closed. The trucks arrive. The city functions. But every delivery takes longer, fuel costs more, and the coordination required to keep the routes from conflicting is itself a resource. A resource the city with the bridge does not spend. Here is my first explicit read on this. Multi-patterning is not a temporary bridge to something better. It is a permanent structural tax on every wafer CXMT processes at advanced nodes. The fab runs on it, but it costs more per wafer, takes longer per wafer, and yields less consistently than the route through a machine the fab cannot buy. That is not an argument that CXMT fails. CXMT produces volume. It is an argument that the network's shape has been permanently altered by the removal of one node, and the altered shape has a price embedded in every wafer that moves through it. ASML's own annual reports and public statements confirm no extreme ultraviolet systems have been delivered to Chinese customers. The company distinguishes its extreme ultraviolet tools from its deep ultraviolet line, which carries its own tiered export licensing status. Certain advanced deep ultraviolet configurations also require licenses that have become more restricted. CXMT's process node has been described in trade press and analyst reports as relying on multi-patterning deep ultraviolet. No independent foundry audit of CXMT's exact process has been published publicly. Node: lithography, extreme ultraviolet pass, a choke point with no bypass. The line terminates here. Deep ultraviolet multi-patterning is a functioning detour that produces volume at mature DRAM nodes. It is not a bypass of extreme ultraviolet. It is a more expensive road to a destination. Extreme ultraviolet reaches more efficiently, and it cannot follow the roadmap where extreme ultraviolet goes next. Before any scanner exposes the wafer, the surface must be coated with photoresist, a light-sensitive chemical that records the pattern the scanner projects. Photoresist for advanced deep ultraviolet processes is not a commodity. The formulations required for tight feature sizes at volume are specialized chemistry, and the supply chain for these materials runs heavily through Japanese companies: JSR, Tokyo Ohka Kogyo, Shin-Etsu Chemical in a separate product line from its wafer business, and Fujifilm. Japan introduced export licensing requirements for certain semiconductor materials, including photoresist formulations in scope, effective mid-2023. Think of photoresist as the film in the camera. The scanner is sophisticated hardware, but without the film that correctly captures the exposure, the image does not resolve. A photoresist that performs at 99% of specification for a given wavelength and feature size is not adequate for the yield math at scale. The error that seems marginal on a single wafer propagates across thousands of wafers per month, and at volume, it shows up in the fraction of functional chips per disk. The practical effect of Japan's controls on CXMT specifically, whether stockpiling preceded the restrictions, whether domestic alternatives exist at the required quality levels, whether licensing exceptions apply, is not fully documented in public sources. Reports suggest Chinese chemical companies have active development programs for domestic photoresist. Independent confirmation of qualification at leading-edge deep ultraviolet process nodes is not yet established in public literature. Node: advanced photoresist, a choke point with a bypass under construction, no confirmed volume at leading-edge specifications. Domestic Chinese chemistry development is reported and credible, but independent qualification data for deep ultraviolet photoresist at CXMT's process nodes is not yet public, and the line is not confirmed clear. Now the dead end, not the detour, the actual terminal node on the map. The machine in Veldhoven that CXMT cannot buy is an extreme ultraviolet scanner. ASML is the only manufacturer of extreme ultraviolet scanners in the world. There is no second source. That is not a policy condition. It is an engineering condition that results from decades of concentrated development. The machine depends on a supply chain of its own. Laser systems that generate the plasma-producing extreme ultraviolet light, mirrors polished to atomic tolerances across a surface the size of a dinner plate, a tin droplet delivery system precisely timed to intercept the laser pulses. These subsystems come from specialized suppliers distributed across the Netherlands, Germany, the United States, and Japan. Every major jurisdiction in that supply chain has now implemented or coordinated export controls. The machine is not just one company, it is a network of capabilities, and that network sits almost entirely in allied jurisdictions. China's domestic lithography program is centered on SMEE, The Shanghai Microelectronics Equipment Group, SMEE, has produced deep ultraviolet scanners. Independent reports do not confirm SMEE has demonstrated extreme ultraviolet capability at production scale. The physics of extreme ultraviolet lithography are not secret. They are published. The engineering system that produces and controls 13.5 nanometer light reliably at the throughput volumes a production fab requires took the world's most capable optics and laser companies the better part of 3 decades to achieve. The distance between knowing the physics and operating a production system is not closed by intent or investment alone. Now let me push back on my own framing, because there is a version of this story where the density gap does not matter as much as the map implies. Commodity DRAM for data center memory and consumer applications does not always demand the tightest geometry. It demands yield, cost, and volume. If CXMT's target is price competition on DDR4 and DDR5 at mature nodes, and the price competition is real and documented, the detour may be commercially adequate across a wide band of the market for years. I hold that take seriously, but I hold it provisionally because the same detour cannot follow the roadmap toward high bandwidth memory or next-generation stacked memory architectures, and that is where the gap reopens most visibly. The detour serves a defined market band. Outside that band, the map has a hard edge. The bypass coming case is honest enough to state directly. China has state-level resources allocated to domestic semiconductor equipment. It has a national priority directive and a time horizon long enough to absorb failures that would end a private company. History contains examples of technology gaps that seemed structural closing faster than observers expected, particularly when concentrated adversarial investment accelerated iteration. Some analysts argue that SMEE's deep ultraviolet progress is faster than its earlier trajectory would have predicted. The honest version of the bypass coming case is, a 10-year timeline at current investment levels is not obviously impossible. The synthesis is this: the dead end is real now and is likely to remain real for a defined window. The length of that window is genuinely uncertain, and a confident number in either direction goes past the available evidence. What is not uncertain is the cost the dead end imposes today. The wafer in CXMT's fab right now takes a longer, more expensive, lower yield route because the machine at this node is absent. That cost is real and running, regardless of when or whether the dead end eventually gets a bypass. The map as it stands: the silicon wafer node is routed around, domestic capacity runs, purity at leading-edge specs is unconfirmed, but product ships. Mature deposition and etch tooling runs on an installed base with domestic alternatives in development, but unconfirmed at parity with the most advanced configurations. Advanced deep ultraviolet tool configurations face tightening restrictions, with domestic alternatives not confirmed at parity. Leading-edge photoresist chemistry sits under Japanese export controls, with domestic development credible but not independently qualified. And extreme ultraviolet lithography is a hard stop. No domestic alternative at production scale, ASML, the sole global source, and the supply chain that feeds ASML, distributed across jurisdictions that have coordinated their controls. My synthesis call, stated plainly, the network CXMT has assembled is functional and producing volume. It is not self-sufficient in the sense that matters for where memory technology goes next. The bypassed nodes are real bypasses. They hold, they run, they supply product at the nodes they serve. But the network's shape has been bent by the absent extreme ultraviolet node, and that bend costs real money, real yield, and real density on every wafer. The map is not closed. It is a map with a road that ends at a border crossing that is shut, and a detour that works until the destination moves further down the road that crossing leads to. That wafer I followed in, the one that entered CXMT's fab as a polished silicon disk, exits as functional DRAM. The route it traveled cost more and took longer than the route through the machine in Veldhoven. The chip does not carry a label that says so, but the supply web does, if you trace it far enough back. The shape of the gap tells you more than the speed of the chip. A breakthrough changes which nodes are live and which are dark on the map. CXMT's achievement is that a large portion of the map is now live without the blocked tool. The portion that is not live is the portion the blocked tool was the only route to, and that portion grows as the roadmap advances. The question is not whether the detour runs. It runs. The question is where the road it is detouring around goes next, and whether China gets there before the distance becomes permanent. The next node worth tracing from here is the advanced deep ultraviolet scanner itself, specifically whether SMEE's domestic lithography program closes the gap to the tool configurations that now require export licenses, and on what timeline. If you want to follow that line next, put it in the comments. And if this map is useful to you, subscribe. There is more of the web to draw.